Right. Good evening, everyone. Well, good evening, everyone. It's my absolute pleasure as Chief Executive of Coram just to welcome these extraordinarily talented and distinguished women historians who are busy with us reclaiming, I think, really reclaiming the story of women in the 18th and 19th centuries. So why does it matter to Coram as the first and longest continuing children's charity to have the privilege of this discussion? Well, this is a place that is the story, and an untold story all too often, of women who found themselves in a circumstance of extraordinary destitution in the 18th century and facing impossible choices in terms of the care and future of their children, often unborn child. And therefore it's always been a place which is their story, even though our main purpose, which continues today, is the care, rights and welfare of children. Thomas Coram, who was a remarkable bloke, a remarkable chap in the 18th century, very, very progressive, nonetheless depended for the creation of this organisation on his ladies' petition. And the 21 ladies, as he called them, of quality and distinction, who were in fact in many ways the ladies of Queen Caroline's bedchamber, in signing his petition. And they, even though they were grand of birth, had very often shared experiences, both in terms of the risks of labour, the issues of not having rights or entitlements over the future of their children. And therefore, we speculate, felt that there but for the grace of God went they. And as a result of the campaigning and their support, we walk in the footsteps of Thomas Coram today. So we are absolutely privileged to continue that, and please do look at coramstory.org.uk for the digital archive that Coram published last autumn. And it's that linkage to our record, I think, which has played a part in inspiring Maddie's work as an award-winning cultural historian, author and broadcaster, looking at the making of 18th century Britain. But also we feel a special link with Hallie. Hallie, an award-winning best-selling author, now on tour. We're very lucky to have her tonight because she's flying off to the United States tomorrow, really, as she promotes, quite rightly, her new book, The Story of a Murder, The Wives and Mistress and Dr Crippen. And that was just published a few weeks ago, so already smashing the bestsellers, I'm sure. So we have the privilege tonight to listen in on their conversation and then add our voices to it in the eternal rediscovery of the story of women. Thank you very much, and over to you, Maddie.
Thank you very much. Can I check that everyone can hear? Yeah. Can everyone hear us? Great, okay. I'm so excited to be talking to Hallie professionally and on a personal level. She's a huge inspiration to me, and we've talked ourselves out in the green room, so we're just going to sit here in silence for the next half an hour. Hallie, so many people in here will know you because of The Five, which was an amazing book about recovering the lives of the women, the canonical victims of Jack the Ripper, and giving them back some autonomy and something of their lives beyond the moment of their deaths. This is in a slightly similar vein, but it also has huge differences, huge innovations. There's an expansion of what you did with The Five. So how did you come to the story of Dr Crippen? What was it about this story in particular? Because presumably the best-selling author of The Five could have gone anywhere after this point.
Well, I mean, there is something that joins the two stories together, and that is a man, not surprisingly. That is Chief Inspector Walter Dew, who wrote his memoirs, I Caught Crippen. And Inspector Dew had started his career as a young officer investigating the Ripper murders. And when he retired, he wrote his memoirs. And he was most famous for, I'll give you one guess, catching Crippen, and was not shy about telling that story. So Yes, and in fact, one of the things that I say about this particular story, the Crippen murder, or as I like to say, as it was also called, the North London cellar murder, is that it is a story which is largely about women and women's experiences, but has been appropriated by men who wanted to tell this story. And in the capacity of, like Inspector Dew, who told it in his memoirs, centering themselves as heroes. Inspector Dew, Captain Kendall of the Montrose, on the ship on which Crippen and Ethel were caught, all of the barristers involved in the trial, journalists who were involved in covering the story, various music hall personalities who knew the Crippens. Everybody wrote their memoirs. But the women don't often get a chance to tell their side.
Let's talk about some of the layers of that storytelling then, because we culturally know so much about what we think we know about Jack the Ripper. We still have no idea who he was, and that's not even necessarily an interesting question. But when it comes to this story, everyone has had a go at telling the story, the people who were involved at the time and in the decades and centuries since. I think a lot of people coming to the story with some semblance of knowledge about it might know about the Montrose, who might have the image of Crippen with his lover dressed as a teenage boy going across the ocean, and the moment when it's a piece of Edwardian technology that catches them out. And that's certainly what I remembered of this story. But the version of Crippen and the women around him that I have inherited culturally from television, from other books, is a man who was sort of badgered by an overbearing wife. Now, as a historian, I know to be critical of that, and I come into this conversation with you of all people. I know that's not going to be the case. So can you give us the bare bones of the story as you have found it to be?
Yes. And the story that you've heard and the story that most people have heard accords with that. And the interesting thing is, usually, this was a story which was at one point much better known than it is, and known, in its legend. And Crippen used to be in the halls of Madame Tussaud's in his waxwork with Ethel, apparently, and people knew this. What I like to call the Wikipedia version of it, and you've highlighted the fact that it's a story of Dr. Crippen, who is a homeopathist, and he was American, and he married Belle Elmore, who is a music hall performer, and they were both American, and they came to London, and he practiced, basically he sold patent medicines. That's the top note. There's much more to it than that.
There's a lot going on.
There's a lot going on, but this is what the legend is. And poor badgered Dr. Crippen, married to this termagant who was an alcoholic and a shrew and sexually unfaithful. And actually, she wasn't even a good music hall performer. She was terrible, and she failed. And everything about her was a failure as a woman. And so, of course, he fell into the arms of beautiful, sweet Ethel Leneve.
How could he not?
How could he not? This little typist who stared at her shoes the whole time and didn't think anything of anything, was very, very innocent. And so it was decided by Dr. Crippen that he would give his wife some hyoscine hydrobromide and gently put her to sleep. And everybody would forget about her, and then he could go off and marry Ethel. And that wasn't what happened. Something went very wrong with the poisoning. And eventually, Scotland Yard came knocking, Inspector Dew came knocking and put the wind up Crippen and Ethel, and they legged it just as father and son, and they got on a ship to Canada, to Quebec, and that was Captain Kendall's ship. And of course, he wired Scotland Yard, and Inspector Dew got on the Laurentic, which was a faster ship, and got into port beforehand and arrested them. And then they came back, and there was this huge trial, and Crippen was found guilty, and he was hanged. The end.
That was so impressive. We can just go home now. Wow. How to follow. As you say, I mean, there's so much going on, and you will need to buy the book, which is available to buy tonight, to get into that depth, because there are so many twists and turns. There are so many fascinating human beings in this, and in particular, these two women that emerge, Ethel and Belle. We've got the wife, Belle, on the one hand, and Ethel, the demure little typist.
Yes.
She's not, spoiler alert.
Yes.
And I wonder, when you were writing The Five, and you wanted to, whilst being, I suppose, faithful to the historical material, you wanted to write the Ripper out of the story. He wasn't what interested you. You explicitly said that. And of course, with that mystery man in the past, we don't have any information. There are lots of theories, but we can't put a name to the cardboard cutout version of him. But with this story, Crippen is a real flesh and blood person. We know so much about him. We know about his professional life. We know his personal life. As you say, he has a whole history in America before he even comes to Britain. Yes. So how difficult was it to move him to the side, to decenter him? And why is it then these two women in particular who emerge? Because it's so exciting the way that you bring them out, and it seems like a natural emergence. But how much work was that in order to reshuffle those characters?
Actually, not. Well, I mean, the whole thing was a lot of work. You can see it's a very big book. But decentering him was not difficult, because it's about how we think about murder, how we think about. As a historian, I think about murder as a historical event. It's not the story of a murderer, which is why I've called the book Story of Murder. It is a panoramic event. This is an ensemble cast. It is people, this is the case with any crime. And one of the things we learn as historians is that everybody has a point of view. Anybody who was present at an event will have a perspective. And those perspectives are all valid in their own way. And so I wanted to repopulate the story with all of these people and hear their perceptions of not only what was going on, but what they thought of their world and who they were. And it gives us a sense of what the Edwardian era, what the late Victorian era was like. And so it was very easy to decenter him, because actually he's surrounded by so many other interesting people.
Yeah, there's a real cast of characters that come to the surface here. And actually, in the beginning of the book, Hallie, you give a list of players almost.
Yes.
These are real people, but you present them almost as theatrical characters. Let's talk about Belle. This is Crippen's second wife. He is married beforehand.
Yes.
But this is the wife who is immortalised through her murder. And something that came out for me reading this book is how her body, both living and dead, becomes the central focus for so much anxiety, so much attempt at control by Crippen, but by society at large. She's a musical performer, so she is putting herself on a stage. But she often has her autonomy taken away from her, and versions of womanhood stripped from her, placed on her. She is a lot of things to a lot of different people. So tell me a bit about her.
Yeah, I think Belle is a really fascinating character, and really hadn't been explored fully until I feel I did this, because it really surprised me. In previous versions, she's just sort of skated over all of these things that happened to her in her life. She was born in Brooklyn in a tenement, and her mother was German and her father was Polish-Russian, and they were very poor. And when she was a very, very young child, her father died and her mother remarried a German man, Frederick Messenger, who raised her as his own daughter. And again, times were very tough, but she was given a pretty good education. Public education was available in the United States. And her sister said she learned, not only did she speak German fluently, but she also spoke French as well. However, when she was about 16, 17, she went out to service. She went out to become a maid. And she worked for a man called Charles Lincoln, who was... he was a pioneer in what was called forced heating, so central heating at the time. And at the time she joined the household as their maid, he had just basically sent his wife to an asylum and taken her property. So nothing...
Not uncommon.
Not uncommon. Very Gothic as well. And... shortly after that, and obviously we don't know what the circumstances were around the relationship, Belle finds herself pregnant. And he puts her up in her own lodgings. And what becomes evident is that Belle cannot keep the child, and she has an illegal abortion. At that time, abortions were highly illegal in this country, but also in New York especially. You could go to prison for 20 years even if you were present in a room where an abortion took place. And the doctor assisting with that abortion and performing aftercare was Dr. Crippen. And the relationship formed from there. You know, it's kind of creepy. Crippen was a homeopathist, but his speciality was obstetrics and gynecology.
It just sends a shiver down your spine.
Oh, it really, really, really does. And Crippen was fascinated with women's bodies and controlling women's bodies. And so one of the things that was decided very early on, he had a child with his first wife, Charlotte, by the way, who had been a nurse. She was from Ireland, and she had died in very suspicious circumstances in Salt Lake City.
I mean, this is a wild thing that I didn't know about this history, is that there's already a wife who's died
dead.
in this weird way, and there's a big question mark hanging over him.
Yes.
Nobody at the time seems to notice or care.
No, well, that's it, you know, and she's actually put in a pauper's grave, and he leaves her there in the middle of the high desert in Utah. And then he goes on and he marries Belle. But one of the things that he does is, because he doesn't want any more children, he has her sterilized and he has her ovaries removed when she's about 21.
Yeah, I mean, it's a hard read in the book, and we were talking about this beforehand, and it just filled me with the hottest, whitest rage. You know, it's outrageous, and I wonder then how she tries to get some of that autonomy back in her own life, thinking about her as a performer. Do you see that is a way for her to express herself?
I think she is incredible. What I found so amazing about her character was the resilience, because Belle would go on for the rest of her life to talk about this traumatic surgery. She would talk about it to everyone. It took a very long time for it to heal. It had a huge impact on her identity, on her sense of self. She wanted to be a mother. She was raised a devout Catholic, and she was told, you know, Victorian women were told they had to be mothers and wives.
That was where their value lay.
And this woman, at a very young age, had it stripped from her. And so she had to find something of meaning in her life after that. And so, incredibly, she said, I want to be an opera singer. And so he paid for her to be tutored in opera, to take opera lessons in New York, and which was the centre of the kind of operatic world at that time.
Which says a lot about him, because we know that he likes to control.
Yes.
And so on the surface, that seems potentially not the behaviour of someone who would want to do that. But he's very aspirational, isn't he? He likes to think of himself as being elevated and expressly middle class. He's very ambitious.
Yes.
And having an opera singer for a
wife as well. Well, you know, this is, and you know, Crippen is very, he likes showmanship and he likes performance a great deal. And the interesting thing is this, you know, homeopathic medicine / patent medicine, which is what he's practicing at this time. There is a huge crossover between, well, you know, he's a snake oil salesman, and you imagine the old medicine show, and so there is performance wrapped up in that. There's a great tradition of that, and so he loves that. He loves that his wife's a performer, although when he's questioned about it much later, because, you know, obviously there's this question of, you know, 19th century and Edwardian era, acting is really a respectable thing, and so he kind of retrenches. He's very supportive of her. And then when he's moved to London, when he's working for James Monroe Munyon, who is this massively successful patent medicine salesman who wants him to open an outpost in London, Belle says, well, I'm not going to be doing opera in London. I mean, it's going to be too hard, so I'll just go in for music hall. And she completely pivots onto this other profession. And she makes a real go of it. And so she does it for about 7 years. And so this is the thing, is that, people like to poke fun at her and suggest that she was a terrible singer. And it's funny, isn't it? She was so bad. She wasn't bad. In fact, I went and I looked at all of the reviews, and she wasn't bad at all. She had, ovations, and the critics said she was a really fun performer, and the audiences loved her. And but much like today, much like any performing art, I mean, not everybody's going to be Mary Lloyd, not everybody's going to be Dan Leno, and that's what happened.
I had two ancestors who were singers on the musical stage, and they were reviewed very badly. And I have to say, I have inherited their lack of talent. So
really,
it's a terrible shame. So that's Belle on the one hand, and we know that she is killed, and maybe we don't need to dwell too much on the details of what happens to her body. But I want to talk about Ethel, who is the typist who has been sold to us as this very proper, demure, innocent young woman who knows nothing of the crimes that are taking place. And the portrait that you draw out of her, Hallie, is so psychologically complex. At the end of the book, you talk about her. She isn't punished for the crime, but she holds huge anxiety in her body and her mind for the rest of her life, and it really, really haunts her. And you give us a really complicated woman. So again, the Wikipedia version, please. But who is
Ethel
she?
the Neve? Well, that is the question. And as when we were chatting before, I was saying, she is the one thing about this story that haunts me more than anything. Her ambiguity and her, she's really, the society that wants to demonize Belle Elmore, she leans into the other side of, they're like foils, and she knows the way in which she's going to survive is by playing the innocent girl, which is what society wants. But Ethel was not that person. Ethel was incredibly determined and knew what she wanted in life. Now, her background is fascinating because she's born in Diss in a two-room cottage. And her father is a railway clerk, and he's the first person of their family to actually have an education. For centuries, the Neves, as they were called, were agricultural labourers.
Does she add the Le Neve to Le Neve?
Well, actually, Walter, her father, and Ethel have more in common than Ethel and her mother. And her mother, in the interviews that she does, is very critical of her daughter. She was always the one who, she liked silk, and she was getting above herself, and she liked, she'd do her hats up after trips to the West End, and her father kind of encouraged this because Walter wanted to be a singer, and so he moved the family to Hampstead. He wanted to give them all a better life, and he got involved he was part of what we would call today like a barbershop quartet, and sometimes Ethel would appear with him playing the piano, and they paid for music lessons for Ethel and her sister, and they also, it was very important, they were obsessed with becoming middle class, and put both sisters through Pitman's Secretarial College. And this was a gateway to opportunity for girls in the 1890s, because you could get, a white blouse type of job, which meant you would work in a respectable office and work as a typist, and you might even marry your employer. And that was a way to move up the social ladder. And it also gave Ethel a bit of independence. You know, she had a landlady, she lived by herself. Ethel was very much part of the new woman at the time.
You talk about her being independent there, but also ambitious. And of course, she does hitch her wagon to Dr. Crippen.
Yes.
And there's this incredible moment, which frankly beggars belief, where Belle has disappeared. And some of her musical friends are asking where she is, they're concerned. And Crippen has the audacity to turn up at an event with Ethel. Not only that, she is wearing Belle's clothes and her jewellery, right?
Yes. I mean, this is, and I really believe it was Ethel behind that decision. It was, well, I mean, it's so appalling. So Ethel had been waiting. So Crippen kept saying to Ethel that Belle was going to leave him. They had been having a relationship for 6 years. And Belle, any day now, Belle is going to leave me. And but Belle wasn't going to leave him, and you know, she was a devout Catholic and she believed in marriage for life, and it got to the point where they had to do something about it, and Ethel was obsessed with his life because their friends were all celebrities. They were all, because Belle had she'd become the treasurer of the Music Hall Ladies Guild, which was an organisation run by women for women of the music hall. So women who had fallen upon hard times. These ladies, and some of whom, they were very famous, and some of them had husbands who were very famous, and they joined this organisation, would raise money and pay doctor's bills and rent and various things like that. And this is where, you know, really Belle found her métier, and she became friends with all these famous women. And Ethel was very envious of this life. They would go off to all these balls and these parties, and, you know, Belle had all of these beautiful gowns and furs and diamonds. And as soon as Belle disappears, in air quotes, Ethel has her claws on her clothing and jewellery.
She does not skip a beat. She's right in there. She's
right in there. And she's wearing the diamond brooch, she's wearing the rising sun, and she's taking literally Belle's clothing to her seamstress and having it refitted for her.
It's hard to imagine, isn't it? It's so shocking. Yeah. I want to zoom out a bit, Hallie, and talk about how you approach recreating these worlds, because for anyone who has read Hallie's work, you'll know that she blends so beautifully a foundation of the most rigorous and exciting and groundbreaking scholarship with novelistic level writing. And I want to ask a bit about your process in terms of doing both and how you strike the balance, because it is always very tempting when you're sitting and writing as a historian and you're trying to write a scene, and we were talking about this before, that, you know, you sit down and you think, what could this person see out of the window? What could they smell? What was on the plate before them? And it's tempting to do generalizations or to fill in some of the gaps. And you have to constantly rein yourself, well, I do anyway, I have to constantly rein myself in and say, definitely. Well, you don't know they were feeling that, and there is no record to say that. And so how do you strike that balance? Because you create not only an amazing reading of a real history, but a whole world around that. So how do you do it?
Well, I mean, I'm very, very interested in what I would call the embodied experience of life. And I read a lot about what the environment would have been like, what it felt like, what concerned people, what clothes did they wear, what did they eat, what was their environment like. So, for example, you know, when I was creating a picture of Hilldrop Crescent, which is not that far down the road, on the other side of King's Cross, you know, I did a lot of research. I looked at the booth maps, and I read there were notes that were made as they walked the streets about the sort of buildings that were there. I read newspaper articles about the houses. I looked at the censuses to see who lived in those houses. So I had a really strong sense of what the neighbourhood was like. So what are you going to see when you look out the window? Well, you'll find all of that in those sources.
And that is a huge amount of work, by the way, for what might be a couple of lines in the book that gives you a flavour of that world, but that will be hours, if not days, of research.
It's compelling, but I can't stop myself because I want to know.
Yeah, that is so true, and I think I find that as well when you hone in on a particular story and a particular set of people, and then maybe someone else from the periphery will come into the story. And this happens so much, in the story that you're telling, where you have investigators, you've got journalists, you've got all these different people coming in, people from the musical world, and it's quite tempting and actually quite easy to go off on these side quests and to follow them down these routes. I want to ask you about the true crime element of the book, because obviously we've had the 5 from you, and even your previous books were interested in crimes, legal processes, moments in court. You've taken us into everything from the 18th century courtroom to the 19th century brothel and well beyond that. And we've spoken about this before, but in terms of being a historian, ultimately you are trying to tell a real history and to do it justice and to do justice to the very real people who lived those lives. Where do you see your relationship as a historian with true crime? Because it's such a big industry and there are lots of ethical questions around it, and a lot of them you addressed in and around your conversations about the 5. But I wonder if this book has changed your relationship to true crime. Do you see that it's working for you rather than you're contributing to that wider work?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I try to, what I do, I like to think of as ethical true crime. But also I'm first and foremostly, I'm a historian. I'm a social historian. And what is interesting to me about a crime is the source material that a crime creates. That, even today, you speak to anybody who works in the law and they'll tell you, my God, the paperwork. Well, that paperwork was the same. And it's amazing because it's a snapshot of a time with people's voices locked into it. And so, you're interviewing any number of people who are telling you about their daily lives, about their experiences, about their thoughts, about everything, the interiors of their homes and what they owned and what they were wearing and everything. And, I mean, that's priceless information for people like us.
It really is. It's delicious, isn't it? And
yes.
And it is very addictive. I spend a lot of time on the Old Bailey online, which is available to the public.
It's just marvellous.
It is. I will sometimes just sit and put in the names of crimes and then just read about people who've done them in the past.
I know, me too.
Yeah. Kindred spirits, bit weird.
Yeah, totally.
I want to finish by asking how your work affects you and what has maybe stayed with you or possibly haunted you about this book. Because thinking about some of those records that we spend time with, and, we're sat here in the shadow of the Foundling Hospital, and certainly in my work, I've done a lot of work with the Foundling materials, and I actually found myself once having a little cry in the archives, looking at some of the failed petitions of the women in just one summer in 1815, I think. And I was following the story of one woman from my book whose baby does get in. Sadly, he dies 2 weeks later, but he is accepted by the hospital. And for the one woman who gets in, there are, I don't know, maybe 60 women that summer who don't. And I wanted to write a book about each and every one of them. And I actually took myself out of the room to have a fresh air break because I was crying so much. And I thought, I'm a professional historian, this is embarrassing. But, these lives, these events do stay with you, they do affect you. And so I wonder from this story, what have you taken away and what are you sort of struggling to shake?
Well, I mean, Ethel follows me. Ethel is... there is something about... she died in 1967, and her children never knew who she was or what she did. And she claimed to love Crippen till the end of her life. She inherited Crippen's wedding ring and pocket watch, which she gave to her husband, and her husband never knew it was his. She, for example, you will see in the photographs in the book, when she was in court, she wore a riding veil, a motoring veil. It was called blue motoring veil over her hat, so she could maintain privacy. she later put that veil in her daughter's dressing up box and used to watch her play with it. And it makes you wonder. She also gave 2 interviews in the 1920s about her life. And, here was a woman who married a man called Stanley Smith and disappeared into obscurity and wanted obscurity, but then part of her desperately wanted to keep talking about Ethel and Eve. And so how do you balance that? And to me, she is utterly fascinating. Yeah.
Well, you'll have to buy the book to find out more.
Yes.
Please do.
Yes.
Hallie, it's been an absolute pleasure and a privilege. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We now have time for some questions from the audience. Please put up your hand if you have something to ask, and I will run around with a microphone. Please do wait for it to come to you so it will be caught up on the recording. Thank you. You're at the front, so you can go first.
Thank you. Thank you. I very much enjoyed reading the book. I've got about 10 questions, but some would be plot spoilers. But talking about Ethel, I'm reminded of SOE agents after the World War II who just can't
Interesting parallel.
get over their experience, and they're afraid of leaving the house. And I don't know. Have you ever thought that?
Yeah. Well, no. I think there's a really, really interesting parallel. I think I was fascinated by. I mean, she had a series of nervous breakdowns, and she had what I think. I mean, I'm not a psychologist. It seems to have been an episode of dissociative amnesia when she was living in Toronto, and she completely forgot who she was. She didn't know. She collapsed on a street, and then went back and lived with her sister and had a series of nervous breakdowns. And was suffering from paranoia. She thought she was being followed. I think she, weirdly, I don't know, and there are things you can't put in a book, but I had this instinct as I was writing this. This is the first time I've actually shared this. I think she must have been suicidal at one point. I think she must have been. And it was such an intense feeling. But again, as a historian, you think, right, well, there's no evidence, so I can't actually say that. But that was my instinct as I was documenting all of this. Must have been, I think she struggled. And that was the payback for participating in the crime. Yeah.
Why does the theme of murder sell so well in publishing?
You may ask. It's not just publishing. I mean, it's everything. It's TV. It's podcasts. Sometimes I despair when I'm scrolling through Netflix or Apple and, oh God, another murder. I don't want to watch murder. I'm writing about murder. And I think for some people it's a way of connecting to darkness. It's a way of trying to understand that. And then death and murder is such an enormous part of drama and has always been. If you look at Shakespeare, it plays such an enormous role because it is something we are so frightened of. It's such a disruptive event. It's such a cataclysmic event. And so many of us ask the question, how does a person bring themselves to take the life of another person? And I think we struggle with that.
Ouchies. Shall I stand up?
I can see you.
Okay. So first of all, massive fan. And second of all, I had a kind of a plethora of questions that I was thinking up. But the one that kept coming to mind is, like, in the Edwardian era and the Victorian era, but it was a very weird, like, not phenomenon, I don't know the word for it, but women were always expected to be just like this illustration, like the Gibson Girls, there was this classic look and feel and even sound of what a woman was supposed to be. And in this book, you really cleverly talk about how like the emotions of these women were used against them, and how there's this sort of Madonna whore complex between Belle and Ethel. But you do it in such a way that like you really are in the minds of these women, and you know, you forget Harvey Crippen kind of exists until his name is mentioned. And so this is a kind of a strange question, but I was thinking, what like visuals, and did you listen to like any music, or how did you get yourself into the minds of these women with all of their emotions and various turmoils and various good sides and bad sides? Because you really do write them like characters, even though they're very real people, and it makes us as the readers empathize with them and relate to them. So
I'm so glad you noticed that. That's really gratifying for me as a writer. I think empathy is so important, but also trying to understand what the world was like for women at that time. Also reading novels, reading women's memoirs, reading how women thought of the world and thought of themselves, and, you know, understanding the history, you know, that Belle, you know, thinking about where Belle came from and what she would have been exposed to, what she would have wanted, and what she was taught to want. Because that's what, you know, all of us, you know, today, the pressures, what are we supposed to, it's the expectation. And I think I have always, throughout my career, even when I was a postgraduate student, was interested in the historical ideal versus the reality. Because there's the ideal of what society imposes on us, and then there's the reality of people's lives. And that is the most interesting thing. Because as people depart from the ideal, what are they going to be feeling? The guilt, the sorrow, the liberation in some sense, but liberation at what cost? The complexities of those emotions. So I wanted to really understand the mindset of women at that time. Not just women at that time, but of their class and of their background, because that would be different from a woman who was wealthier.
Thank you. That was super interesting. If it's in the book, forgive me, but why didn't Crippen have Ethel sterilized?
Well, who knows what was coming? She had an abortion, and he did, I believe he must have made her have that abortion. And again, I think this is one of these things that's very glossed over in the timeline of their relationship, and the pressure I believe she was exerting on him to get rid of Belle. And she found herself pregnant. And she was pregnant for 4 months. And she was living with her parents at the time, and that is the outer limit of when you can really hide that. And then she went and she got rooms with Mrs. Jackson in Hampstead. And within a fortnight of getting those rooms, she had her so-called miscarriage. Now, it was always going to be called a miscarriage. People didn't talk about it like I had an abortion. It's never talked about like that unless it appears in the newspapers and somebody's going to prison for something that they did. It was botched. So, but that baby could not have been born because he would not have been able to support them. She would have lost her job and her income. And so it was inevitable. He had to make her agree to this. So in a way, he was controlling her body. He was controlling her reproduction. I believe they were using birth control because it prevented her from getting pregnant beforehand. And I think this may have been a case of her not using what was, the cap, which is what would have been available at that time, and doing this to push the issue, and it didn't work.
Hi. I started looking into the story of Dr. Crippen while I was listening to season 2 of your podcast. And I hadn't realised that you were writing this book. And as soon as I realised you were, I sort of stopped researching it because I wanted to read your version. But the thing that really stood out to me was that in the sort of shadow of this tragedy is a story of real joy, because when Belle disappears, her disappearance is highlighted by her friends who do not let it go.
Yeah.
And I just wondered if you could maybe talk a little bit about the joy of her life.
Yes, that's so nice. That's such a nice thing to say. What is so lovely about those women, they fought, and they fought, and their stories are completely submerged. No one ever, it's Inspector Dew saving the day, never mind the fact that these women pursued Crippen, they knocked on his door, they ran down the hallway after him, they chased him, they hired a private detective, they did everything in their power. And then, they also testified at the trial. And then they got the law changed, inheritance law changed. So somebody who murders their spouse cannot inherit their property. And they were relentless. And it is a testament to friendship. And I really felt that very acutely. And I think this is one of the things that we in our culture don't celebrate, is friendship. We don't talk about it the way we talk about romantic love or familial love. The love between mother and children or father and children, and the love between friends is such a beautiful thing, because nobody makes you want to fight for that person or want to be with that person. It is completely by choice. And I'm so glad you saw that, because I felt a real celebration of something that we don't often talk about in society.
Long way round.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Hiya. I only started reading this book last night, and I'm already probably about a third of the way in, and I'm loving it. So, and I had work today, so very tired at the moment. My question is about when you kind of read court testimonies. And I'm assuming that they don't all agree with each other, and they have conflicting accounts. How do you decide who you believe and who you trust in it? And are you biased by being like, actually, I just quite like this person, and I feel like they might be more trustworthy?
I try not to do that, and it's really hard as a historian not to like anybody. What often happens, and what happened with this, which I absolutely loved, is there are certain points where you have one version of events and then you have somebody else telling the other version. So when Inspector Dew goes to 39 Hilldrop Crescent and knocks on the door and Ethel answers, we have Ethel's whole version of what happened. And then we have Dew's version of what happened in his police report and then in his memoirs. So they're three separate versions. And what's really interesting is that they do align. And so you'll see what I've done. I switch points of view. So, for example, when Ethel turns up at the Criterion wearing the Rising Sun brooch, I switch points of view between the Music Hall Ladies Guild, who are observing this, and Ethel, and what this means for her, and what she was, what this triumphant debut on Crippen's arm must have meant for her. So it's about trying to give everybody a voice, because in history, sometimes it's just a lot of voices, and we don't know which is the definitive one, because history is about a lot of opinions and a lot of argument, and that's just the way it is, and we have to be comfortable with that.
Sorry. That's all right. Thank you.
Hi, I'm curious about Nina's relationship and what appears to be her unwavering support of Ethel. But did you come across any doubts that she ever had at any point?
Nina is another interesting. Nina was Ethel's sister, and they were almost twins. I think they were born 11 months apart and very, very close. And she really toes the line, doesn't she? And she gets at one point, what I was very interesting reading her one of her witness statements that she gave to the police was she like Ethel, becomes really obstructive. The police are asking her questions, and she's saying, well, I don't know. And no, you can't have all the clothes that my sister gave me, even though they belong to the dead woman. And I thought, my God, that takes a lot of gumption, doesn't it? She seemed to stick with Ethel all the way through. I think she must have suspected something. But once you start towing the line, it just doesn't make sense to... You don't want to ask too many questions, being a family member. And I think she must have suspected. And I also think she knew about her relationship with Crippen much earlier and didn't let on.
I'm going to make the executive decision that we're going to take 2 more questions. And then, Maddie, if you're happy to send us out and mention the work that you and Hallie have recently done together as well. So 2 more questions. At the back.
Hi, thanks so much. I really enjoyed the book, like many in the room. My question is also about Ethel, because like many, I found her really creepy and no, truly, but enigmatic as well, mysterious. And I'm wondering, one of the things you do really compellingly in the book is sort of go through all of the statements she made and sort of catch her out in her lies. And I think that's really important work. I wonder how obvious those lies were, or was it a process of engaging with the source material again and again and sort of realizing how dire and sort of appalling this was?
Yeah, laying out. I mean, especially, her account of what happened at the very, very beginning of February, because she gives 3 or 4 different versions of the story. So this is when she finds out that, quote unquote, Belle Elmore has gone to America, okay? Supposedly she had no idea. And it's interesting, so, obviously she gives her account to Inspector Dew when she's interviewed. And by the way, absolutely, she and Crippen had a story going, and they had agreed. They were con artists. He was a fraudster, and she was a fraudster because she ran his schemes with him, and she had to deal all the time with people turning up and asking uncomfortable questions, and she ran interference and did all sorts of things. So they worked as a twosome, and so they had a story which was watertight, which they stuck to, and you can tell that in her statement. She only gave 1 statement to the police, and his statement. She then subsequently gives an interview in 1920-21, another one in 1928. And as time progresses, she admits more and more of her complicity. It's like she literally forgets what she had said. And so there was this funny thing about, was it the night of the 3rd or something, the night of the 5th? I think it was the night of the 3rd, and Crippen had said, well, no, she spent the night, and Ethel at first said, no, I didn't. And then later on, she said, oh, I think I might have spent the night. Well, if she was there, she saw everything. And I am 100% convinced she was part of the cleanup, which is why she had that breakdown at Mrs. Jackson's that night, because she had seen the murder scene.
One final question.
Thank you. I was really struck by the story of Crippen's first wife, a bit of a contrast with what happened with Elle. And as another question mentioned, it was so nice that her friends really stuck up for her and basically sort of stopped Crippen from getting away with it. And I was struck when I was reading it that in the first wife's case, it really was the opposite. Yeah. And not to give any spoilers, but I think it was her brother who said that he should have followed up on it more. And it seemed to me like her family sort of forgot about her and she was abandoned in a way. And do you think that it's possible that, if she had had friends and family who did sort of look into what happened more, I mean, this whole thing might never have happened at all?
Absolutely. And yes, it is really interesting. I do wonder what had happened with Charlotte. I feel there must have been some rift with her family at some point, like they didn't approve of him. Again, what's so frustrating and yet so tantalizing at the same time is how little there is to tell us about Charlotte. And, this woman must have been incredibly strong. She had had 2 careers by the age of 30 in the 19th century. She was a trained teacher, and then she was a trained nurse. And, she went west, and she had immigrated from Ireland. And I think she was a maverick. I think it may have been she did not, her family didn't even know where she was married. So I think something happened at some point. There was some rift. And I think that's why no one followed it up. I think, shame be on William Bell for not doing that. And we don't know the story. I mean, it would be wonderful one day to find out, but I don't know if we ever will.
Well, thank you everyone for those questions. I feel like we could do 20 more hours asking you.
I have to say that these have been the absolute best questions I have had in doing these events, and I love every minute of it, because when you live with this stuff in your head for so long, you want other people to live with it in their head and have the same questions.
I feel it should come with an apology, maybe. Well, Hallie, thank you so much. This is a historian who paves the way and inspires so many young historians, myself included. So thank you very much. Hallie's book is available to buy afterwards, and possibly she'll be signing some
I will
copies.
be signing.
At a discounted price, no less. And if you do want to hear more of this conversation, I did have Hallie on my podcast, which is a History Hit podcast after dark, and we talked about this book and your work as a historian generally, so you can get that wherever you get your podcast. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Hallie.
Thank you.
And a final thank you to Madeleine Pelling for hosting today's discussion. So yeah, please join us for another drink and a book and some cake. And thank you.